The Rhodesians had always been a minority in their own country, and that had never caused any particular problems. The whites ran the country and created civilization from nothing, whilst the Africans were able to essentially chill in their huts all day and live off of the white man's welfare, attend the white man's free schooling if they wanted, and enjoy the white man's hospitals and other amenities. Only in the 1960s was the true extent of the population imbalance revealed when two censuses were conducted. This also coincided with the time of subversive African nationalism. The African majority, which had never contributed a single thing to Rhodesia, now wanted to rule Rhodesia simply due to weight of numbers. As things stood in 1962, when the first census was conducted, there was 220,610 whites and roughly 3.6 million Africans. The whites were outnumbered by 18 to 1. The white population of Rhodesia had always been rather transient, meaning that many settlers left the country, but they were always replaced by many new settlers entering the country. If the nation were to survive, it was decided, then a lot more would have to be coming in than going out. Rhodesia would need a solid and attractive immigration program. A few things before we begin. Firstly, this video is on a slightly controversial topic given its racial themes, so I must state that this video is purely a work of history. It is not in any way, shape, or form political. Please do not overthink this video and make it into something it is not. Thank you. Secondly, a huge thank you to those of you who have signed up to my Subscribe Star or on Ko-fi. In the latter case, it also includes those of you who have kindly left me one-time donations as well. Since my last video, Buy Me a Coffee arbitrarily removed me from their platform for political reasons, and so Ko-fi, as a replacement, has been a real lifesaver. If you had previously signed up on Buy Me a Coffee, or just wanted to drop me a one-time donation to the channel, then please do consider clicking the link in the description. It really does go a long way, and Ko-fi, kindly, doesn't even take a cut of the subscription or donation. Thank you. The African birth rate was simply not something that the white man could compete with, and even attempting to do so was not even suggested. The game was always going to have to be played using immigration. From 1955 to 1972, for example, 60% of the white population growth came from migration. By comparison, this figure was 35% in Australia and 32% in South Africa. Immigration served a double purpose. High immigration not only gave the benefits of the individuals themselves coming in, but also boosted morale for the population as a whole. P.K. Vanderbilt, two-time Minister of Immigration, described immigration as, quote, a delicate barometer of Rhodesia's self-confidence, and whenever this was less positive, the barometer reacted immediately, end quote. MP Bruce George, meanwhile, stated, quote, immigration to and immigration from Rhodesia provides a good barometer of the morale of the population, end quote. Migration also provided a sort of snowball effect. Each immigrant that arrived in Rhodesia would by default grow Rhodesia's overseas networks via their family and friends, who then, too, could become Rhodesian immigrants. It was this latter type who tended to actually stay in Rhodesia once they arrived due to the family connection. Regardless of type, each and every immigrant that arrived reinforced the point that the white regime was there to stay. Every white man that settled down in Rhodesia would strengthen Ian Smith's hand in future negotiations. The opposite, however, was of course also true. There were two types of prospective migrant. There was the whites, already in Africa, and the whites from outside Africa. Historian James Morris described the former group, who tended to float about between different African colonies, depending on job opportunities, as, quote, imperial bums, those loiterers, beachcombers, and scavengers who roamed the empire from end to end, and the same rogue Briton might turn up in Queensland and Borneo, Egypt and Rhodesia, wherever the presence of the empire gave them some nominal protection and privilege, end quote. As Britain's other colonies in Africa were handed over to the black masses, their civil service and other professions were emptied out of whites and Africanized. The highly skilled whites from places like Zambia quickly became part of this group of wanderers who ended up in Rhodesia. Kenya, perhaps most of all, saw the greatest relocation of whites from one colony to another. During the Mau Mau Rebellion, the reaction of the cowardly British government was actually to hand the country over faster and hasten the Africanization process. Whites were offered lump sum compensation payments to take a hike. One former policeman wrote the following poem, quote, farewell and adieu to you, Kenya coppers. Farewell and adieu to you, lads left behind. For we've opted to go under limited lumpers. and we praise the day that we opted and signed. So think of us kindly and look us up, please. We'll be standing in line at the Crown Agent's office, searching for jobs in what's left overseas." End quote. The ensuing battle between Rhodesia and South Africa to attract these whites was won by the Rhodesians, who offered passage schemes and other incentives. This lot, however, were often gone as quickly as they came. The Rhodesia Herald wrote in 1968, quote, "In the wider vision days of the 40s and 50s, the drain of Europeans from one part of Africa to another was not a prime target of immigration ministers. It was recognized that these migrants moved as jobs offered and would soon try their luck over yet another of the many horizons. In the event, white Africa has drawn back to the Zambezi, and suitable horizons are scarce. Much effort is now being made by individual countries to attract as many as possible of the Europeans leaving the remaining white pockets of the Black Continent." End quote. The actual final destination for these whites tended to be South Africa. With the collapse of the Congo, Kenya, and Zambia, South Africa seemed to offer much more stability in the long run than Rhodesia, which was in the middle of a war and wasn't a recognized state like her southern neighbor. Sure, thousands of them drifted through Rhodesia, but their final destination tended to be further south. Conversely, the greatest source of Rhodesia's immigrants was South Africa, and also, obviously, the main destination for her emigrants. Actual Britons from Britain itself were not much interested in migrating to Rhodesia, despite being extremely interested in emigration in general. A 1966 poll asked the British public if they had ever seriously considered going to settle in another country. 30% replied yes. Of those, 42% said they considered Australia, 27% New Zealand, 24% Canada, 6% the USA, 5% South Africa, and only 2% said Rhodesia. One of the main issues for Brits was that of migrating to an illegal regime. They were also subject to around-the-clock propaganda condemning Rhodesia as some kind of racist far-right state. Rhodesia certainly had her loyal support base in Britain, but the common man who didn't know any better never stood a chance against such a barrage of propaganda. Ending Rhodesia's illegal status would require essentially handing over the country to the blacks, which, in turn, would destroy the country. This left the Rhodesians in quite the bind. The entire attraction of Rhodesia was how lovely of a place it was to live in. An advertisement in a Dublin newspaper from 1969 read, quote, "The 10,000 Irish in Rhodesia will be drowning the Shamrock tomorrow. Granted, they have no Croke Park, but they have just the weather to give them a powerful thirst. If you want a spacious home, good wages, reasonable taxation, first-class school, expert medical attention, help for the missus in the house, and a bright sunny future for all, if you want assisted passages for yourself and your family if you qualify, and a 2-year special concession where a family with 2 children can earn up to £1,748 tax-free, come out and have a pint." End quote. And an advertisement from the Spectator magazine in 1973, quote, "Rhodesia, it isn't easy to find that haven to escape to anymore. Most of the world's idyllic retreats are getting a little tarnished, and prices aren't what they once were, to say nothing of taxes. But there is one last retreat where Britain's way of life is still treasured, and life has a special tempo of its own. Where endless sunny days and peaceful ways let one forget the problems of life elsewhere. Rhodesia, a land of leisurely pursuits and sophisticated facilities, of outstanding service and good neighborliness, where money still goes a lot further and taxes are low. There are spacious homes, domestic help, modern health amenities, fast communications, and uncrowded cities. The arts are catered for, and sport is second to none, no matter what you fancy. Rhodesia is dedicated to preserving a way of life we all cherish. We would like you to be a part of it." End quote. And more explicitly, for an American audience in 1970, quote, "Promote yourself. Why wait for promotion? Promote yourself out of the rat race and into your kind of future. Then go to the top fast in Rhodesia. You'll get higher wages, lower taxes, more take-home pay that goes further in a country where almost everything costs less. On top of this, you'll enjoy one of the world's highest standards of living in a booming, stable country, and a sun-filled outdoors way of life. Move now, before the rush. Rhodesia offers a chance to move up in your field, take greater responsibility, and be well paid for it. The rapidly expanding economy means plenty of room for top talent in almost every field, and there are incentives for immigrants, assisted passages, substantial tax abatements in your first 2 financial years, lower cost of living because of cheaper food and lower rents, excellent medical services, good schools, a wide variety of entertainment and sport, and almost 12 months a year of sunshine. Go places in Rhodesia, end quote. This strategy was overselling Rhodesia, to put it lightly, and, quite understandably, many of the new immigrants left a few years after their arrival upon the realization that war-torn Rhodesia wasn't all it was cracked up to be. The disappointed migrants took their disappointment with them back to their countries of origin and, via word of mouth, made Rhodesia an even more unattractive prospect abroad. After 1972, when the Bush War really began to escalate, the Rhodesians found themselves having even more trouble selling their nation to the world. As Anthony Lake wrote from the US in 1976, quote, "It was not enough for the regime to demonstrate that white Rhodesians can survive. It must demonstrate that white Rhodesians can survive comfortably as well," end quote. The war at this point only really affected Rhodesia's northeast, the sharp end, as Rhodesians would have called it. But the foreign press was obviously far more interested in more headline-grabbing horror stories than anything else going on in Rhodesia at the time. Rhodesia, to outsiders, sounded like a very dangerous place to go in general. Ian Smith once said, quote, "It is amazing how people, including our friends from South Africa, are led to believe that it is dangerous to cross the border," end quote. The state, obviously, just wanted white immigration. This made perfect sense. The whites of Rhodesia were the only contributors. With an African population breeding like rabbits, it certainly didn't need more dependents coming in from abroad, more people to pay for, more people to care for. No, instead, they needed as many white bodies as they could get. This, however, had to be said less explicitly. Different divisions were employed instead, which perfectly aligned with race. White immigration was justified by saying that the state only wanted skilled rather than unskilled migrants, capitalized rather than non-capitalized migrants, entrepreneurial rather than non-entrepreneurial migrants, and taxpayers rather than social welfare drainers. All of this matched perfectly with race. The Sadie Report of 1967 stated, quote, "Economic development is fundamentally a function of the religious, social, and cultural values of a society and the psychological traits of its members, which together constitute a way of life. A study of the Bantu peoples of Africa reveals the absence at this stage of most of those elements which are conducive to economic growth as an endogenous process. The professional and technical men and those skills and experience which are prerequisites to the employment of workers in the lower echelons of the skilled hierarchy cannot simply be imparted to an economically underdeveloped people by way of a crash program of education and instruction," end quote. With the help of this pseudo-economic language, the state presented their white-only immigration policy as being apolitical, administrative, and bureaucratic. As Josiah Brownell puts it, quote, "An exercise in cool-headed economics, rather than hot-headed bigotry," end quote. A Rhodesian front backbencher echoed these sentiments in 1969, quote, "Immigration is vital to this country. It is vital that we close the population gap between the Africans on the one side and the Europeans on the other. I am not being racial in this. I am dealing with it from the point of view of the development of the country. The Europeans who come here develop the country, and as they develop the country, so employment opportunities occur for all races, not only for the European or the African," end quote. His point was quite right. More white immigration did indeed improve life for everyone in Rhodesia, not just whites. But ultimately, the policy was racial. Another argument the government made was that white immigrants did not need training and thus would save the nation money in regards to schooling. In 1965, then Minister of Immigration, Harry Reedman, argued, quote, "The cost of learning is high everywhere, but to bring in people who have learned various skills and techniques at the cost of other nations is clearly an advantage. We save instantly on their education and subsistence and accrue a stock in trade of their aggregate skills and take in these new assets on a free on-board basis. I would say, what a value consignment," end quote. It was argued that immigration, even including assisted passages and settling down costs for the state, was cheaper than paying for years of expensive schooling for Rhodesian-born whites, never mind the blacks. Brownell, again, quote, "As a result of these assumptions of racialized skills and potentialities, the state's immigration policy was always defended as the simple and, on the surface, non-political syllogism. The economy needed skills and capital. Only white people had the necessary skills and capital, and therefore the state's policy was to attract only whites," end quote. The African MPs fully understood the game being played here and said as much in Parliament, which often led to the whites having to tortuously defend their position without mentioning race, which, obviously, was quite the task. The defense of the government's policy was somewhat of an art in itself. Some could parry the African MPs' questions rather well, others were just obviously caught out. Behind closed doors, though, the government fully admitted what they were doing and laid out that they wanted whites for political reasons to fix the racial imbalance, a far cry from the economic reasons fed to the masses. In October 1969, after the second Rhodesian census, the Rhodesian Front Congress unanimously passed a resolution which made immigration less selective, which, essentially, was blatantly showing the racial character of Rhodesia's immigration policy. Whites were to be admitted en masse, regardless of who they were, what their skills were, or, more importantly, where they came from. The desire to keep Rhodesia as British as possible fell victim to the desire to simply keep Rhodesia in white hands in general. If Rhodesia had to become less British in order to survive, then that was a price the Rhodesians were willing to pay. Previously, before UDI, the government policy had high capital requirements, a massive pro-British bias, and the guiding principle of the entire policy was that there be no direct competition with people already in the country. Winston Field, Ian Smith's predecessor as PM, had aimed to keep down white unemployment and was very conscious of not creating a subclass of poor whites via immigration. Too many immigrants coming in too fast would result in an employment bottleneck. All the new immigrants simply would not be able to fit into Rhodesia's economic structure. Another fear, which was explicitly stated, was that low-quality white immigrants and the creation of a white underclass would result in race mixing, since lower-class whites in the US and elsewhere were far more prone to indulge in such behavior. Rhodesia simply could not tolerate a blurring of the color lines like in South Africa, which possessed a gigantic mixed, or colored, population. In regards to the economy, it was very important previously not to flood Rhodesia too fast. Standard of living was everything if the government was to entice people to move to such a remote paradise. The quality of living in Rhodesia was the highest in the world for Africans, but also extremely high, if not the highest, for whites. There was simply nowhere else on earth which could compare. The only recent comparison would have been the British in India. In Rhodesia, even artisans and craftsmen could afford domestic servants, as well as a detached home with a car and a swimming pool. In 1952, there was one car for every 4 whites in Rhodesia. The US only reached this ratio in 1977. In 1970, it was found that 97% of whites had refrigerators, 1/6 had swimming pools, and 1/5 had a hi-fi music system. The kind of life the average white man could enjoy in Rhodesia was absolutely miles apart from that of its country of origin, especially for the less qualified white immigrants who turned up in Rhodesia. Now all of these restrictions and worries were going out the window. The then immigration minister, P.K. Vanderbilt, openly contradicted the government's public policy in his speech at the Congress. He said that Rhodesia's industrialists were constantly pressing to allow skilled coloured, that is, mixed-raced or brown, rather than simply black, labour from South Africa. PK stated that he had always turned down these requests and instead proposed allowing in unskilled whites and then training them once they arrived in the country. PK went on to say that it was deplorable that non-British immigrants were still discriminated against. The government, he said, completely rejected the idea that Rhodesia must remain as a, quote, preserve for the English way of life, end quote. He instead said that Rhodesia's immigration policy should be, quote, as unselective as possible, end quote, and that the government should only deny residence to, quote, rogues, scalawags, and criminals, end quote. This Congress, unlike the others, was well reported and far from hidden behind closed doors. PK's words were often repeated back to him and argued about, but the government remained steadfast and continued their policy of saying one thing in public whilst meaning another and saying so behind the scenes. The Africans were obviously less than pleased about all this. The reason for increased white immigration was obviously that the blacks were breeding like rabbits and swamping the whites. This, though, could be flipped on its head in terrorist propaganda. An article in Zapu's Zimbabwe Review from 1970 read, quote, whilst the settlers are, on the one hand, fielding this birth control campaign among Africans on the excuse of a population-strained economy, they are, on the other, advertising for increased immigration from Europe. Who can fail to realize the whole trick in the circumstances, end quote. Ever since he was an independent MP in 1961, Ian Smith had put white immigration at the forefront and was constantly pestering the government about the worrying immigration trends. In his mind, the floodgates needed to be opened, and he specifically named Germans, both West and East, as well as white Kenyans, as his ideal candidates. Upon coming to power via the internal Rhodesian Front Party coup in April 1964, Ian Smith created a new cabinet position, that of Minister of Immigration, the first post of its kind in Rhodesian history. The man chosen for the task was Harry Reedman, a businessman with a long history of interest in immigration issues. The creation of the position itself and the choice of the man to step into it was a major statement of intent. Reedman had always been in favour of quite literal mass white immigration. Before UDI, an attaché from the British High Commission in Salisbury wrote of Reedman's reputation, quote, "Mr. Reedman is renowned for his grandiose visions, bordering on the grotesque, of large-scale immigration into Rhodesia," end quote. Reedman viewed Rhodesia in the same vein as Australia, or, at least, that was what he wanted Rhodesia to be. This, obviously, meant a white majority. Some of Reedman's justifications for such levels of immigration were sometimes rather out there. On one occasion, he stated that whites must come to defend Rhodesia from the Chinese, who would soon come to Africa in large numbers to settle. This was but one of his rather outlandish public statements, which made a bit of a joke of the goal of mass white immigration as a viable policy. Once in the cabinet, Reedman pushed hard for the approval of a highly ambitious, although extremely vague, mass immigration scheme, but this particular plan was rejected. As early as July 1964, the cabinet did, however, agree that, quote, "It was essential to have a bold immigration policy, as the African population would double itself in 20 years, and the racial ratio would be reduced," end quote. So by this point, in 1964, even before UDI, mass immigration had been accepted as a policy principle, but this obviously was not the same as planning for mass immigration. The government dropped their selectivity requirements, created a new immigration promotion department, and essentially pushed ahead without any plans for absorbing such a large number of people. The cabinet agreed that, quote, "The doors should be opened wide immediately to everyone of European stock, subject to health requirements and police records. All selection should be removed which would militate against mass immigration," end quote, and went on to say, quote, "The target must be to reduce the present ratio of 16:1 Africans to Europeans to 5:1, and as soon as possible," end quote. No explanation was given of the exact figures here, but essentially, this would put Rhodesia at the same sort of demographic level as South Africa, a far more manageable situation. In these days, as you can see, the government was far more explicit about the racial aspects of their policy, or rather, they admitted that the policy was just entirely racial. Despite most agreeing with Reedman and his desire for mass immigration, he was replaced as immigration minister by Jack Howman in July 1965. Howman was initially welcomed by the Rhodesia Herald as a more moderate and clear-minded choice for the position. In fact, he had resigned from the Rhodesian Front when Smith had launched his coup and was viewed far differently from the right-wingers of the party. Right from the get-go, he reduced the inflated expectations regarding immigration, and indeed, he was quite right to do so. A 5:1 population ratio was simply impossible. There was no way on earth that enough whites could be convinced to move, never mind be accommodated for. Rhodesia had not yet declared UDI in these months of 1965, and so, due to the political uncertainty, immigration promotion efforts were temporarily suspended, and assisted passages were phased out until a more opportune moment. The lax selectivity standards brought in by Reedman, however, remained. Howman frankly described this broad selectivity criteria in 1965, quote, "First of all, that he has white skin. I think that is accepted. Secondly, he must be free from active tuberculosis. Thirdly, he must not be a criminal. Fourthly, he must not be a communist. Then we go to the next criteria of whether or not he needs help and he is fitted and able to take work and contribute," end quote. It was only in July 1967, after UDI, that a new immigration drive was launched and the Rhodesian people were called upon to forward propaganda literature to their contacts abroad. In a contradictory fashion, however, Howman argued for a reinstitution of the earlier selectivity requirements at the same time as he called upon this new influx of whites. His argument was that Rhodesia already had a large reservoir of unskilled labor and that, quote, "In any case, uncontrolled immigration could lead to the growth of a white trash element and, ultimately, generate embarrassing problems in regards to racial segregation," end quote. Howman's suggestion was rejected, and he was forced to maintain the lax entry standards. In a 1968 cabinet reshuffle, he was replaced by P.K. Vanderbilt, an Afrikaner and one of Rhodesia's most fascinating characters. Putting an Afrikaner as the Minister of Immigration was in itself quite a statement of intent from Smith, a clear signal that this was to be a new, united white Rhodesia, not one riven by the age-old British-Afrikaner rivalry. Much of Rhodesia's early policies had actually been about excluding Afrikaners specifically. Rhodesia was now to be an outpost of white, not just British, civilization. Many Rhodesians obviously weren't too happy with this, and there was some low-level xenophobia towards Southern Europeans, especially from the original mostly British, minority Afrikaner population. The Rhodesian government had to plead with their whites to welcome in these new residents, and, showing just how much things had changed, the promotional literature for Rhodesia was printed in 6 other European languages, as well as English. Crash courses in English for new arrivals were even considered. Bizarrely, the most anti-Southern European element of Rhodesian society was the blacks, and their nickname for the Portuguese was fish fryers, due to the large numbers of them who worked in fish and chip shops in the cities. Presumably, the blacks felt these types of low-skilled jobs were reserved for them. But, to Rhodesians, a fact of life was simply that black labour was unreliable and prone to quit on the spot or cause other undue difficulties. When the option was there to choose cheap European labour instead, then it was always a simple decision. This new pan-European vision of Rhodesia was as far as the government was willing to go. There was no question of Asians or colours being included. PK dismissed the idea of bringing in rich Indians as ridiculous. During his tenure, Vanderbilt expanded the scope of Rhodesia's incentive programs to entice immigrants to the country. At the time, there was a lot of competition for skilled immigrants, and so he really did have to be on top of his game. The use of tax money to pay for the travel fare of new migrants was perhaps the most famous program, and, indeed, this is what all those nations like Australia and South Africa did at the time. In Parliament, it was argued, quote, "Study throughout the world indicates that unless you provide assistance to immigrants, you cannot get those immigrants. Australia does it, New Zealand does it, South Africa does it, and if we are to get the immigrants we need, we must do so as well." End quote. On top of this, PK introduced tax incentives, state-subsidized housing, and the postponement of military service for immigrants. PK also mailed unsolicited literature to carefully chosen localities abroad, which the Rhodesians reckoned could provide them with new immigrants. On one occasion, PK even appealed to Rhodesians to open up their homes to allow new immigrants to stay with them until they were settled in. Prizes were even offered to Rhodesians who could bring in the most positive responses from their foreign contacts. In this 1969 campaign, the winner would get a free weekend holiday within the country, the runner-up would get a refrigerator, and third place would get a new record player. The most embarrassing campaign was the Settler 74 campaign, in which Rhodesians were once again asked to harass their foreign contacts to move to Rhodesia. Hundreds of thousands of new immigrants was the goal. Forms were mailed to residents and placed in large cutout adverts in newspapers. Current residents were informed of the benefits of mass immigration. Quote, "They will enjoy a much better life out here, and they'll ensure your future. So do them and yourself a favour." End quote. By February, a month after the campaign had been launched, the government was already retreating. Their rhetoric went from going for what used to be almost 1 million potential immigrant names and went down to the far less ambitious number of 100,000 new immigrants. By May 1974, only 4,200 names of potential immigrants had been received, and the campaign was abandoned. Vanderbilt really was trying his best, and he certainly wasn't afraid to get creative. He was, however, fighting a very uphill battle. In 1966, the UN passed mandatory selective sanctions on Rhodesia, and then, in 1968, passed mandatory comprehensive sanctions. The latter included a section on immigration to Rhodesia. Domestic legislation in Britain forbade the solicitation or encouragement of emigration to Rhodesia from Britain. This left the mainstream media sources of Britain completely out of bounds for the Rhodesians. In 1970, PK spoke of his difficulties abroad. Quote, "Immigration promotion is subject to UN mandatory sanctions, and it is subject to a special ordering council of the British government. It is second only to 1 or 2 of our commodities as regards the degree of difficulty which sanctions have inflicted on us. The fact of the matter is that we are very limited indeed as to the avenues in which we can promote immigration, because it is forbidden in practically every country in the world for us to place newspaper advertisements, which were the main source of immigration promotion in the past. But nonetheless, we do find, and I'm not going to go into any detail on this, we do find ways of doing it from time to time." End quote. The 1970s saw a British crackdown on those evading the anti-Rhodesian measures, and both The Economist and The Spectator magazines were prosecuted and fined. Even tiny regional newspapers or special interest periodicals, such as the very niche Ophthalmic Optician, were mercilessly targeted by the British state. On top of these measures, the British government restricted how much money those openly moving to Rhodesia could bring with them. Ultimately, however, those taking the trip simply claimed that their destination was South Africa and then just headed further north into Rhodesia. Despite pretty much everyone dodging the financial restrictions, the measures were very off-putting for those who were on the fence about making the move. This, combined with the intense social stigma from every level of society, as well as anti-white propaganda which painted Rhodesia and even South Africa as evil, made choosing Canada, Australia, or New Zealand a far more attractive option. For some, of course, all this made Rhodesia seem even more attractive. This was the real Britain. Rhodesia was a big middle finger to the hopelessly lost modern world, to the Third World, to communism, and to appeasement of the seething Afro-Asian bloc. This was the white man at his best. Rhodesia was defiant, a gallant symbol, the very essence of what Britain stood for. To imperial sentimentalists, this was immensely attractive. Given that this was an age of intense anti-white propaganda and suicidal empathy for the benefit of the Third World, however, such patriots were very much in the minority. In 1974, one of them stated his reason for choosing Rhodesia, quote, "I see Rhodesia as the last bastion of the British Empire," end quote. Most of those in Britain who were sympathetic to Rhodesia would obviously not have emigrated. Raising a toast of defiance to good old Smithy in a London pub was quite different to actually relocating to the other side of the planet. Regardless, in general, Rhodesian migration trends saw liberals leaving and conservatives entering, a net positive for literally everybody. Vanderbilt left the immigration post in 1974 and was replaced by Vickers de Kock, another Afrikaner. During the following years, there was an influx of Portuguese migrants arriving from Mozambique and Angola. This did much to mask the increasing level of emigration going on. In 1975, the grace period in which immigrants were exempt from military service was reduced from 5 to 2 years. With so many going out, and, temporarily, so many coming in, the previous measures were just too lax if Rhodesia wanted to keep up a functioning military. Embarrassingly for the Smith government, de Kock, the literal immigration minister, emigrated in 1977. Vanderbilt, once more, took the reins that autumn. The year beforehand, Smith, after the Americans had put a gun to his head, acknowledged that majority rule was inevitable. The goal now was to build or maintain a white population large enough to hold their own and maintain their well-earned privilege in a black-ruled Rhodesia. Immigration spending in the late 1970s remained high, but there were very few immigrants. Emigration went through the roof. The Portuguese influx dried up, and immigration from elsewhere was brought right down. Rhodesia was falling apart at the seams. No matter what nonsense Smith tried to spin, everybody knew that a black-ruled Rhodesia would be very bleak indeed for the white man. This was not an attractive prospect for anyone. In 1975, there was a net influx of 1,928 people into Rhodesia, that being 12,425 in and 10,497 out. The following year saw a net decrease of 7,072 people. 1977 saw 10,908, and in 1978, that figure had risen to 13,709. 1979 figures were incomplete, but similar. To put it into perspective, in 1978, there were 4,360 immigrants and 18,069 emigrants. Rhodesia was finished. Looking back, Rhodesian migration policies were totally incoherent. In the early 1970s, when immigration was at its peak, the Rhodesian economy was straining under the weight of the white influx. Affordable housing was in particularly short supply, and bottlenecks were created in which new arrivals ended up simply leaving before they could even be slotted into the economy. This was precisely the problem that Winston Field, once upon a time, had sought to avoid. The government just kept seeking to pump in more whites for the short-term political and morale benefits, but none of the long-term issues were ever addressed. Would Rhodesia even have been the same place had such policies continued for another few decades? The state simply couldn't handle so many people at once, never mind people from so many different places. All of the spending on the horde of newcomers and the benefits they were given ended up, quite rightly, enraging the current residents of Rhodesia who felt neglected. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do leave a like. It helps immensely. And, as always, an especially big thank you to those of you who are subscribed to me on Subscribestar or on Ko-Fi. Even the lowest tier or a one-time donation on Ko-Fi helps immensely. That is purely thanks to your generosity that I'm able to make these videos for a living, and I cannot thank you enough. Cheers.